attitudes of nations and affected their traditional values in daily life. Never before in history has man advanced so dramatically in discovering ways and means to appease his psychosocial needs and relieve his pain and anxiety. As a testimony to this, we witness the enormous synthesis and rapid dissemination of various types of mood and mind-altering substances and the practice of TM and relaxation techniques and so forth. The notion of stress and its popular rise since the 1930s also stimulated new efforts and research in coping with the stress and strain of life and opened a new era in human adaptation in the distressful environment. Medicine, which was traditionally thought to be an art of healing for diseases of physical organs or physical origins, is challenged to produce satisfying remedies for the invisible wounds of human mind and soul, and to break through human fear and despair. The response has been overwhelming. Now we have soothing remedies for everything. We can alleviate fear and anxiety in some cases and excite the depressed and apathetic mood in others. We can stimulate or inhibit the appetite, tame a violent temper, and change a person's vision and perception of his world through psychoactive substances. Through these discoveries, human reason, which is the most precious gift bestowed upon him, can be altered, and from a meek individual, a monster of violence and destruction can be unleashed. It has been estimated that less than 1 milligram of LSD dissolved in the water reservoir is sufficient to turn the population of a city such as New York insane. In the Western world, considerable emphasis is placed on the necessity of feeling pleasure in the daily life experiences. To feel better or to experience instant relief from any kind of discomfort are part of the ingredient of health. Pain and suffering are unacceptable conditions as much as pleasure and comfort are searched for as vital necessities. This lifestyle is continuously nurtured and reinforced through social contacts and the news media such as television. On the other hand, by the very competitive and achievement orientations of the present-day industrial society, the individual is exposed to a perpetual dread of failure which will frustrate his inner needs. In such circumstances, a search for seemingly calming substances such as alcohol and psychoactive drugs will begin. Consumption of these substances will gratify temporarily the internal needs for security and at the same time will mask the individual's painful realization of his inability to solve his problems. Thus, it will further delay his growth and maturity. When pain and suffering, particularly of a psychological nature, were intervened or ceased prematurely, certain experiences essential for growth will not take place. As a result, such a deprivation ultimately will hinder a person from actualizing his potentials and fulfilling his purpose of living in this world. May I have the first slide, please? Now, this figure illustrates the phases that a self-centered individual, on the left side up, self-centered individual will go through in relation to an intensely competitive social structure which will frustrate his narcissistic needs. Having been unable to accept the reality of failure and cope with the distress generated from it, he seeks out a chemical solution to a basically moral dilemma. As alcohol and psychoactive substances are available, so is instant relief. What's happening here is this. The self-centered individual on the left upper side, who is living in a society which is achievement-oriented, he will develop a type of relationship which is a type of competitive relationship. Now, as a result of this kind of relationship, he will develop a type of vulnerability to failure based on the self-centeredness of his nature or narcissistic desire that he has in him. As a result of this vulnerability, he will develop a state of emotional insecurity, which could be expressed in anxiety, depression, and so forth. And then he will look for a type of remedy, and this remedy which he is looking for is a type of instant relief. Again, because of the very nature of his narcissistic desire, his self-centeredness, he is looking for something which could alleviate his anxiety instantly. For this purpose, he will look for the possibilities, for the options available to him to bring an instant relief are drugs and alcohol. As a result, he starts to consume alcohol and drugs to get an instant relief from pain of anxiety and failure. And then these medications, these drugs, will give him a type of gratification or a type of desensitization from his anxiety which he is suffering. And therefore, this becomes a type of reward, internal reward for him, which further reinforces his self-centeredness. Therefore, a vicious circle goes on. His needs, living in a type of competitive society, and then his feeling of frustration, and then vulnerability to failure, and consequently for something to relieve his anxiety, which he receives the gratification, and subsequently he is happier, and then self-centeredness is reinforced, and then goes back to the same person without anything that he learned in this process. Here you see a group of teenagers who were interviewed, and the question was asked was this: what do you think you are getting out of drugs? 69% of them said that experiencing more, or in other words, to feel better. And only 1% said learning something about themselves, self-knowledge. And the rest is, for example, love and friendship, 5%, escape, as a means of escape, 10%, for the kicks, 12%, for peace, and so forth, all of them in much lower than what they were aiming at, and that is to say, for feeling better or experiencing more. This further supports the hypothesis that overconsciousness of feeling and senses, rather than of knowing and insight, has a contributing role in the motives of drug use, although this is by no means unique, nor can one isolate feeling from thinking. Let's now reflect for a few moments on the interrelationship of sensory and spiritual values. Dr. Khadem, this afternoon, she made my task easier by defining the relationship between mind and soul, and mind and body. However, there is a very important quotation which she mentioned, and I have to repeat it because of the final analysis which I'm going to use this quotation. As you heard, according to Abdu'l Baha, man is endowed with 5 outward powers through which he perceives the material world of existence. These are the power of sight, hearing, taste, smell, and feeling. Man has also spiritual powers, Abdu'l Baha continues: imagination, which conceives things; thought, which reflects upon realities; comprehension, which comprehends realities; memory, which retains whatever man imagines, thinks, and comprehends. The intermediary between the 5 outward powers and the inward powers is the sense which they possess in common, that is to say, the sense which acts between the outer and inner powers and conveys to the inward power whatever the outer powers discern. For instance, sight is of the outer power. It sees and perceives the flower and conveys this perception to the inner power, the common faculty, which transmits this perception to the power of imagination, which in its turn conceives and forms this image and transmits it to the power of thought. The power of thought reflects and, having grasped the reality, conveys it to the power of comprehension. The comprehension, when it has comprehended it, delivers the image of the object perceived to the memory, and the memory keeps it in its repository. From this analogy, we can appreciate the chain of events or stimuli which carry messages from the outer world of matter to the inner world of spiritual reality. These messages may excite or inhibit emotion, the consequences of which is the expression of mood and feeling. It may spark a novel cognitive activity and bring about a new thought or idea. It is important to note, however, that under certain conditions, the perception of the sensory organs and the interpretation of the perceived images or messages may become distorted, thus giving rise to a wrong impression of an external reality. As an example, in an alcohol-induced delirium state or alcoholic intoxication, a rose may not be perceived as a rose, rather a frightening object creeping into the observer's mind and arousing an enormous amount of fear and anxiety. Thus, the consumption of an intoxicant caused a misperception of reality, which is defined as an illusion. The hallucinogenic substances, such as LSD, affect the inner power, particularly so the power of imagination and grasp of reality, the result of which is impairment of judgment and experience of hallucinations. The human mind, as described by Abdu'l Baha, is the power of the human spirit or the rational soul. Mind is the perfection of the spirit and is its essential quality, as the sun's rays are the essential necessity of the sun. Okay, here we see this figure is not complete. In a way, it points to those important spiritual powers or expression of the rational soul, that is to say, intelligence, imagination, knowledge and reason, comprehension, and memory. Now, all of these are emerging from mind and consciousness, and we are going to see what are the effects of drugs on these 5 faculties, that is to say, on intelligence, imagination, reason, comprehension, and memory. And therefore, then we can conclude if the drugs have direct or indirect relationship with the development and evolution of the soul. In the Bahá'í concept of the reality of man, the soul occupies the highest place in human existence. It is like the center of human organism, around which revolves the intellectual, emotional, physical, social, and the spiritual realities of human existence. Now, the various realities or dimensions are not isolated from each other. Here you see, soul, according to the Bahá'í concept, is the reality of man, around which we can see the intellectual, emotional, physical, social aspects or dimension of human existence. I had no other place but to put spiritual in one of these areas. However, as you see, the line is punctuated, and that is done intentionally in order to give you an impression that spiritual is covering all over, and in fact has an upper hand over all other dimensions, that is to say, intellectual, emotional, physical, and social aspects of human reality. In a well-balanced life, the soul remains as the center of the spiritual gravity, bringing all other essential dimensions into a creative harmony and interaction. As to the development of human potentials, we find in the Bahá'í writings that these energies, Abdul Baha says, these energies with which God has endowed the reality of man lie, however, latent within him, even as the flame is hidden within the candle and the rays of light are potentially present in the lamp. The radiance of these energies may lie obscured by worldly desires, even as the light of the sun can be concealed beneath the stars and dross which cover the mirror. Unless the dross, Abdul Baha says, is blotted out from the face of the mirror, it can never represent the image of the sun nor reflect its light and glory. Now a few words on the effect of alcohol and drugs on the mind and the soul. For practical purposes and simplicity, the word substance is used in most of the places here to demonstrate alcohol and all kinds of drug of abuse. The term abuse is primarily referred here to all non-medical and illicit drug use of any kind, including drug addiction. The psychoactive effects of drugs can be divided in two groups. One, alteration of consciousness. Two, changes in mood and feeling. Now, consciousness is the cognitive faculty of mind which has the important function of perception, comprehension, and preparation for reaction to the external or internal events or stimuli. In medical practice, the perceptual capacity of consciousness may need to be altered, for example, reduced as in surgical operation to avoid pain, or its focus be shifted out of control of the person by means of psychological suggestions such as in hypnosis. In some religious circles, as in the Ismailiyya sect in the Middle East, for the first time in the 13th century, hashish was used in group by some of its believers during their night-long religious rituals in order to attain some mystical experiences. Among the substances which lower the level of consciousness and inhibit the sensory perception are opiates, of which particularly morphine and heroin have been subject of abuse and addiction. And as you see in the first line, says here, psychoactive substances, two groups, consciousness, alteration of consciousness, or mood. Those which alter the consciousness, you see, first one, inhibition of sensory perception, and that is one of those which affect the sensory perception is morphine, which lead to a state of oblivion or perceptual anesthesia. Now, another type of medication or drug which affect this sensory perception in different way, it stimulates sensory perception, is LSD or mescaline, for example. And these hallucinogenic drugs, they would cause a type of morbid perception of reality, a type of delusion or hallucination, a type of internal reality which is far from the real. Now, the second part, that is to say that the effect of drugs on mood and feeling, they are divided also in two groups. One group, that is to say, those which induce a state of euphoria, a state of excitement, among which one of them is amphetamine or speed. And the ultimate result will be a state of depression. The person starts to feel excitement, euphoric mood, and eventually goes into depressive state, and then he needs to excite himself by the drugs, so therefore he starts to use amphetamine. Another group of the drugs which affect the feeling and mood are those of barbiturates, which bring a state of a very calm state of mind, and at the same time a state of lethargy and torpor. And eventual result again is depression and dependence like the others. Viktor Frankl believes that extinction of human sensitivity by means of narcotization is in a sense a spiritual anesthesia which can lead to a spiritual death. According to Frankl, consistent suppression of intrinsically meaningful emotional impulses because of their possible unpleasurable tone ends in killing of person's inner life. For every emotional experience, there is a meaning deeply rooted in human reality. Suppression of certain unpleasant emotions is like elimination of pain without identification of its underlying cause, and thus denial of symptoms which otherwise conveys a valuable message. Equally significant is artificial induction of nirvana mood or any alteration of feeling to that effect which could disturb the homeostasis of normal emotional activities. Now, a few words about the statistical aspects of drug use in today's world, especially in North America. In February 1970, a Newsweek survey indicated that 30 to 50% of all high school students in the United States have made regular use of marijuana. In 1976, President Gerald Ford, in his message to the United States Congress, stated that 5,000 Americans die each year of drugs with related causes, and it was estimated that over $80 million is spent annually by the U.S. government for providing comprehensive drug control programs. A report of the prevalence of drug abuse among the adult population of Ontario in the same year revealed that the drug problem was found the most important only after inflation and unemployment. In a survey of senior high school students in California in 1974, 61% of male and 58% of female students consumed marijuana. 10% of all high school students, senior students, in another study, smoked this drug at least once a day. The prevalence of cannabis has continued an upward trend in the recent years, and it has also affected the pre-teenager group as young as 8 years of age. Drug abuse among college students has been extensive, and contrary to public opinion, the students in some professional fields which involve the highest moral responsibilities in society were not spared. In a Northeastern University of the United States, a study on the students of the faculties of law and medicine whose graduates are considered as the custodians of human rights and justice and the preservers of health and healing reported these startling findings. 73% of the students of law and 68% of the students of medicine had used marijuana. Normal Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws in 1976 estimated that a total number of 35 million Americans used this drug and that 10 million of them were regular users. The use of hallucinogenic drugs such as LSD is not as prevalent in North America as it was in the 1960s, and certainly its use is less frequent than cannabis. In the 1970s, alcohol consumption among the teenagers began to rise, and this added more confusion to the polydrug use among the adolescents. The juvenile consumption of alcohol has increasingly disseminated since then, and although drugs such as cannabis regained their popularity in the recent years, alcohol consumption alone or in combination with the drugs continued to rise. According to Chavez, 5% of American youth in 1970 had alcoholic problems. A national survey of the high school students in the United States in 1974 revealed that 63% of the boys and 54% of the girls of the 7th grade have had a drink. This figure rose significantly. By the time they reached the 12th grade, where 93% of the boys and 87% of the girls had used alcohol. According to Sidney Cohen, the former director of the Division of Narcotic Addiction and Drug Abuse in the United States, juvenile use of multiple drugs with alcohol has become a growing problem in recent years. Furthermore, the consumption of alcohol is penetrating among younger high school students, and its prevalence among girls has risen to the extent that by the time of graduation, as many girls as boys have used alcoholic beverages, but not with the same frequency. The spread of alcohol consumption, like drugs, among the adolescent girls has also caused another serious problem, and that is its effect on early pregnancy among the teenagers and the possibility of subsequent birth defects, especially fetal alcohol syndrome, which now is a recognized clinical entity among the alcoholic women. In 1975, there were 27 groups of Alcoholics Anonymous only for the teenagers in the southern part of California. And there are similar programs in other parts of North America at present time. Now, the next table here, this table shows that some aspects of drug abuse among teenagers. In this study, when the adolescents were asked to indicate the contributing factors which helped them to stay off drugs, 26% mentioned willpower or self-determination as the most rated contributing factor, followed by 10% saying no payoff, 9% fear, and 9% therapy. Now, religion's role was rated only 7%. One has to take into the consideration the degree of religious belief practiced in the teenagers' families, and it is not clear for us to what extent really they had the adherence to their religion. What is surprising is the absence of the crucial role of education in this study. This survey shows the significance of volition and personal choice in drug abuse. However, the strength of self-determination depends to a great extent on a number of variables, among which the childhood education and parental attitudes toward alcohol and drugs are of prime importance. Now, what is the meaning and what are the implications of drug-induced euphoria? Among drug users, many of these drug users have their own concepts of freedom, and they challenge the rules and moral standards set by society. Ironically, the ultimate destiny of an alcoholic or drug addict is a loss of the very freedom that they initially anticipated. Now how? They soon realize that by becoming dependent on a chemical substance, the tolerance will rise, and a larger amount of the substance will be required in order to get the same satisfaction. An additional realization is that failing to obtain the necessary drug in a certain length of time will mean an impending psychophysiological withdrawal state, which could be quite painful and disastrous. The addict is, of course, highly conscious of this, and by the very virtue of his dependency is very vulnerable to the undesirable consequences. Therefore, he faces two moral dilemmas. One, he has lost his freedom to be himself by becoming dependent on a lifeless, a speechless, and indifferent chemical agent to which he can't even communicate. Rather, submit his own will to this chemical agent in order to escape from the frightening experience of withdrawal. The fear and anguish of a forthcoming withdrawal attack in the event of failure to obtain the addicting substance may be so intense that the primary objective of achieving pleasure and euphoria will be of secondary importance. Hence, pleasure is replaced by fear in a perpetual struggle for existence. Shakespeare, in his play Othello, wrote, "O thou invisible spirit of wine, if thou hast no name to be known by, let's call thee devil. O God, that men should put an enemy in their mouth to steal away their brains." Now, another aspect, in an effort to avoid a possible withdrawal state, the addicted person finds it necessary to make any attempt to ensure sufficient supply in his possession, or to obtain the drug of his dependency by whatever means possible. The rules of ethics and the governing laws of society may have to be attacked and challenged in order to achieve his goal. Therefore, assaults of any kind, robbery, breaking and entry, and violence entailing murder may become the unfortunate consequences. The addict victim, in his desperate mood and possibly impaired judgment, may endanger his own life unless psychiatric help is sought. Drug-induced violence and aggressive behavior has been reported and is familiar to many of us. It is to be noted that not all drugs cause addiction, and depending on the substances and the length of consumption, addiction may be psychological or more profound, and that is to say biological. Now, during the following minutes, I would like to concentrate on the subject of prevention of drug abuse and alcoholism. Among the various ingredients for individual and collective security in human society are the sense of purpose and conviction in life, the reliance on a faith or system of belief to which the alienated youth and the discouraged humanity can turn to for guidance and direction. When such a sense of belongingness to a divine reality is absent, and when the life crises are compounded with anguish of hopelessness and emptiness, the psychoactive substances are sought as alternatives. However, this is not an unequivocal response to stress, as the previous attitudes, and I repeat, the previous attitudes plays a decisive role on the choice of chemical solution. Today, behavioral scientists agree that attitudes more than knowledge will influence the initiation of certain behavior. Attitudes are acquired during early education and learning processes and adopted as a way of life later. The learned attitudes will represent a person's values, and the values will guide one's choice of behavior, such as drinking or abstaining from drinking. The writings of the Baha'i faith are very explicit in respect to the attitude toward the use of these substances. It requires total abstinence from all alcoholic drinks. Never before in the history has the utterance of a divine manifestation been so explicit on the effects of the toxic substances such as alcohol and narcotics on the human mind and soul. One of the principles enshrined in the fundamental character of the Baha'i revelation is obedience to the laws of this dispensation. In fact, the true liberty in Baha'u'llah's words is the obedience to the ordinances of God. Now, this obedience in abstaining from the toxic substances will protect individual's freedom to be his true self, as we already indicated. The Baha'i position in respect to the use of drugs such as marijuana and hashish is very clear. Abdul Baha indicates that alcohol consumeth the mind and causes man to commit acts of absurdity. But this wicked hashish extinguishes the mind, freezes the spirit, petrifies the soul, wastes the body, and leaves man frustrated and lost. The teaching of Baha'u'llah are also emphatic in regard to the use of opium, which is forbidden in the Kitab-i-Aqdas, the most holy book. It also admonishes the uses of hallucinogenic substances such as LSD and so forth. The Universal House of Justice, in one of the messages, they stated that concerning the so-called spiritual virtues of hallucinogens, a spiritual stimulation should come from turning one's heart to Baha'u'llah and not through physical means such as drugs and agents. A very great responsibility for the future peace and well-being of the world is borne by the youth of today. Let the Baha'i youth be the power of the cause they espouse by the shining example for their companions. Abdul Baha exhorted Baha'is against the non-medical use of drugs such as hashish in these emphatic words. This is the worst of all intoxicants, and its prohibition is explicitly revealed. Its use causes the disintegration of thoughts and complete torpor of the soul. Some 70 years later, Professor Lal of the Andrew University in the United States, while citing other researchers, echoed this prophecy of Abdul Baha by reporting to the Second World Congress for Prevention of Alcoholism and Drug Dependency that marijuana, which is a milder form of hashish, is, quote, the most dangerous drug with which we must contend, unquote. He further noted that the chronic cannabis consumption will result in deterioration of mental functioning. Now, just match it with what Abdul Baha said earlier. Deterioration of mental functioning, pathological forms of thinking resembling paranoia, and a massive and chronic passivity and lack of motivation, the so-called amotivational syndrome. Concerning the consumption of alcoholic beverages, according to the Kitab al-Aqdas, it is forbidden, for it is the cause of chronic diseases, weakens the nerves, and consumes the mind. Become ye intoxicated with the wine of the love of God, and not with that which deadeneth your mind. Any preventive measure for a problem so pervasive and prevalent in Western Hemisphere should be comprehensive, taking into consideration all dimensions of human reality. Most of today's programs are aimed at treatment and rehabilitation of young and adult drug addicts and alcoholics, and very few, if any, positive and comprehensive program can be found which has been tested and proved successful for primary prevention. In contrary, significant investments are made each year by the government and private enterprises in production and distribution of alcohol and other habit-forming substances. The media, sports, and public events of national and international interest have continued to reflect the popular use of alcoholic drinks, and it is very rare, at least in this part of the world, to attend an anniversary where alcoholic beverages are not served. Yet, the general consensus is that alcohol is harmful for human health and growth, and medicine is unable to surmount its heavy toll each year. The young and growing generation of today's world is perplexed and disillusioned by the hypocrisy of the adult world, a world which does not practice what it proclaims. Many of them witness this contradiction in their very home, in the behavior and attitude of their parents and relatives. Early education and parental attitudes play an important role in the constitution of the future habits of children. In a family where the mother's daily headache can only be relieved by aspirin or Valium, and usually the drug which is advertised best in the television, at a home where the father cannot sleep without a pill and often needs a drink before starting his day, or a sister who has a strange habit of getting stoned when she goes to a party. In all of these circumstances, children are receiving behavioral messages which will consciously or subconsciously shape their future strategies of coping with internal and external stress. Research in the problem of juvenile alcohol and drug abuse supports the notion that substance abusers frequently come from families where quite often one of the parents is found alcoholic or drinks in excess or is involved in drug abuse. In order to establish a comprehensive prevention plan, a number of factors merit serious consideration. Now, this table shows a glance of some of the commonly observed contributing elements in the substance abuse. The understanding of this will help us in constructing the preventive measures. These are cultural and family attitudes and habits, childhood education, social incentives such as availability, acceptability, and advertisement of the drugs and alcohol, personal will to pleasure, to feel better, alienation, loneliness, feeling of personal failure, rage or boredom, search for identity, search for escape, and so forth and so on. Now, Among these, some are of prime importance, such as the role of family and culture, childhood education, availability of drugs, and dysphoric mood, such as loneliness, depression, personal failure, and so on. The following is a brief outline of some thoughts on the integration of a comprehensive program for prevention of adolescent alcoholism and drug abuse. It involves education in 3 levels of community life as follows. 1, on the individual level. Teaching children on the relationship of man to his creator and to himself is of utmost importance. The former strengthen their faith and their obedience to the laws and precepts of Baha'u'llah, while the latter helps them to understand that they are entrusted with the gift of life in their physical being. The human body is like a temple within which the light of divine reality shines forth. Man is responsible for the well-being of this temple and the light of a spirit within it. The children should recognize the nobility of their nature and the creative purpose of their lives. Childhood education should also emphasize the necessity of acceptance of hardship, discomfort, and adversity as some of the essential elements of growth and maturity, and not the signs of evil and misfortune. They must acquire a capacity to postpone the will for an instant gratification and pleasure. Adolescence is an age of transition and growth, learning and adventure, and a restless search for a new beginning. The adolescent has the dual task of adjusting to his internal psychobiological changes and, in the same time, coping with the stress of a rapidly changing world around him. Under this psychosocial climate of change and transition, they may find the task of adjusting very distressful situation quite hard. And therefore, in some cases, they may turn into substances of abuse. They need to understand and to be understood, to understand the nature of their own rhythms of impulses of psychobiological nature, as well as the awakening force of their spiritual search for a new identity. Now, just a few words on the family level. As the cornerstone of society, family plays an important role in the preventive programs for the substance abuse. As mentioned earlier, the parents are the first to set the examples. The parents' attitudes and styles of reacting to both the joy and pain of life will become an important model of learning for their children. The practice of serving alcohol at home, for example, whatever the reason may be, can influence the youth and children's attitude toward its consumption. Therefore, the family should provide a healthy and drug-free environment for their children through their own behavioral model. Now, just to finish, a few words about the role of community and education in the community level. The integration of individual members of community into a program based on love and unity of purpose will promote a healthy growth within the community. An ideal community model would be the one which will provide various contingencies for dynamic interaction of the youth. It will stimulate their enthusiasm in fulfilling their highest aspiration in the service of humanity, and provides positive alternatives to toxic agents and boredom of modern life. Through encouragement, the society should help the youth to release their potentials for progress and find ample opportunities for their intellectual, emotional, and spiritual stimulations, and hence eliminate any desire for alcohol or drug-induced euphoria or excitement. The society should also discourage the availability and consumption of habit-forming substances by law and collective efforts through educational programs at homes, in schools, and all learning institutions. Today, there are substantial evidences to suggest that a sense of alienation, boredom, and lack of faith and spiritual belongingness to a divine reality are some of the causes at the very root of the epidemic of youth drug dependency. Therefore, to eliminate this epidemic or to prevent its forceful tides to man needs a discipline and vigor universal in scope and a guiding principle and purpose common to all, which will give a new meaning to life of all mankind, as we see in the teachings of Baha'u'llah and as it is exemplified in the Bahá'í community around the world.